5,
4,
3,
2,
1. But who's counting, right?
His name is Major.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen,
please welcome Major Garrett.
From the nation's capital.
Major, fantastic.
It's The Takeout.
This is a major achievement.
With CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent,
Major Garrett, yes, CBS, yes, hi.
Major Garrett.
Major, that's nonsense, and you should know better.
Is Major out of the doghouse?
The answer is yes.
Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. I'm Major Garrett. This is The Takeout. We are in a place we've never been before, may never come back to, so we're going to savor it. That's what you do with moments like that in your life, and one of the reasons I know that is because when I introduce our special guest and talk about his book, I will let you know that his book, American Ramble, written by Neil King Jr., taught me about that process of savoring, about finding places in which you can be surprised and joyful about things you've never experienced before. I want to let you know where we're at, this place we've never been, we may never come back to. It is the Grill at Harriman House in Reisterstown, Maryland. It's important in the book. We'll get to that in a second. Neil King, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's a real pleasure. I like how you opened that.
Thank you. The subtitle of the book is A Walk of Memory and Renewal. So let's focus on that first big word, walk. Where did you walk and why?
I walked out my door 9 blocks east of the U.S. Capitol, and I turned left and made my way to see Abe Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial, and then over almost a month, I made my way in a kind of arcing path to Central Park in Manhattan. So it was a walk from my house to New York.
And how long did it take you? 26 days?
26 days.
How many miles?
It was 330 miles, so obviously a much more roundabout way than the straight-up 95 route. Yeah.
What did you take with you?
Very little. I had a limited, a small backpack, a couple of changes of clothes, 1 pair of shoes, a very light fly rod to do some fly fishing, a laptop. I had to do some writing along the way. Water bottle. It was about 17 pounds all told. I was not camping. I didn't have a tent, didn't have a sleeping bag. I was sleeping in Airbnbs and inns and funky places along the way. But I wanted to keep it light.
Mm-hmm. Did you take any paper maps with you?
I did, actually. I had some kind of torn out, detailed maps, particularly of Pennsylvania, and I had a Rand McNally. And occasionally I use them. But, our phones, which aren't really phones, they're everything but phones in some ways, they do wondrous things, and I relied a lot on the phone mapping.
What was your intention?
That is a complicated question because I had so many intentions, but I think the simplest intention was to pay attention to this big expanse of a story in between these two places. I call it one of the founding swaths of America. So much of our history had taken place there between those two places, Civil War history, pre-European history, yep. Independence, War of Independence, the drafting of the Constitution, all that stuff. And it was also to connect, we had gone through the horrors of the 2020 COVID experience. I left at the end of March of 2021 in that brief opening, kind of COVID spring when we thought we were coming out of it. We had been vaccinated, et cetera. And I really wanted to get out, mix it up with people, and kind of, I say in the book, see if America is still possible or had seen its best days. There was a little bit of that, kind of taking a pulse of the country. And, that's, I guess, maybe the best description of it, or the why of it.
As folks listen to you on CBS News Streaming or on radio stations around the country or on the podcast platforms, they hear a bit of a catch in your voice.
Yeah.
Explain that to them. Because I think they're somehow related. They're intertwined here.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I mean, for one, this has nothing to do with my voice, but I'd had 5-6 years ago a cancer scare that had been a real scare. I had faced the real prospect of having decades taken away and not, decades that I was counting on. I escaped that, thankfully. And then at the end of the summer of 2020, I got bit by a tick. I got Lyme disease, which is super common around this part of the mid-Atlantic. And it botched up one of my vocal cords. So that in itself has been a whole long saga. For a while, my voice kind of didn't exist. It's better now.
I would file Lyme disease under the category unappreciated menace. it's much worse than I think people
Absolutely.
imagine it to be, and it can sneak up on you literally and figuratively quickly.
Yeah, and my version of it, despite the fact that it's given my voice this kind of gravelly quality, has been among the lesser experiences you could have, because people have had their lives completely upended and botched up in big, grave ways, all kinds of muscular problems, all kinds of things that really, where they're just depleted. And so thankfully it hasn't been that way for me.
I want to let our audience know that this is a magnificent book. It's beautiful to read. It is about Neil King Jr.'s walk and America, but it's also about yourself. It's impossible to read this book and not crawl into some places into yourself that you maybe hadn't thought about ever, or you set aside for a while. Discoveries, idea of what time means, idea of what wonder means, what splendor means, what fear means, and how you regard it, and how fear intersects with your life, and maybe how you apply it in places you're not always conscious of. It is remarkable in its achievement that way. But I want to ask you about a couple of very big themes in the book. Somewhere people and anywhere people.
Yeah.
Who are they?
So I walked through a very settled part of the country. I mean, a lot of areas where the original people that had settled that patch of ground were still essentially there. Their descendants were still there. That is the nature of so much of America, where you go through places that were settled by the Mennonites or the Amish, or by some wave of German settlers in the late 1600s or whatever, and their people are by and large still there. And most of us who live in Washington or live in New York, who have meandered around with our careers, who went away to college, we are what I call anywhere people. We are kind of at home anywhere. We've lived a whole bunch of places. We don't deeply belong to any one particular place. We don't find our identity rooted in that ground. And yet I was walking through an area very much made up of somewhere people that were very much about that place. They found their identity there, their kin were there, and my interaction with them as a kind of versatile wandering anywhere person, I just found that whole thing really rich.
Have you always been a wanderer?
I have, actually, in a lot of ways. I mean, it's funny because I grew up very much as a somewhere person. My family went back 4 generations in Colorado. They were among the first settlers of the state. I mean, as European incomers up to the state. But as soon as I graduated from high school, I hit the road, and I've lived in multiple countries, and I've been in every state in the country, I'm sure, pretty much as you have. And back in the day when we used to hitchhike and things like that, I crossed the country multiple times in that fashion. And one of the things that the book is about is kind of inserting yourself into other people's lives. You mentioned the fear factor. Mm-hmm. We do live controlled by a lot of fear now. I've always sort of pushed the bounds a bit on putting myself out there and relying on the kindness of strangers, as the expression goes, and seeing how that plays out. And I find that experience really worthwhile and really meaningful.
We have about a minute to go before we go to our first break. You write in the book about that experience in your 20s. I mean, you really were a wanderer. I mean, you went globally on not very much money. You would work odd jobs and just sustain yourself, kind of live off the land, and saw things.
Yeah. No, I took one big trip around the world, which was fantastic. I was gone for 17, 18 months. I was in a Buddhist monastery. I worked in a vineyard in the south of France, at a clothing factory in Germany. And, that was a wonderful, wonderful stretch. And in some ways, I think this walk was a very belated continuation of that experience.
And did you find yourself remembering your youthful self?
Yeah. And, I think all of us feel the continuum of that self pretty strongly, at least I do. I mean, I'm very aware that I'm not 22. But on the other hand, I can feel the 22. And in a lot of ways, I say in the book that I had made a vow to myself in my 50s that when I got to my 60s, I wanted to do it as a kind of redux of my 20s, but without all the angst of what am I going to become, who am I going to marry, where am I going to live. And this walk has been part of that project in a lot of ways.
I would say, as someone who's also in his 60s, one of the great endeavors is to minimize angst and move on with discovery. And that's what, in part, American Ramble A Walk of Memory and Renewals about Neil King Jr. is our special guest. We're in Reisterstown, Maryland. More on that in just 1 second. Stay tuned for segment 2 of the Takeout in just a minute.
I had a lot of those experiences, and I was like, whoa, these are like parable quality experiences. And so that kind of started to engender this kind of like spiritual thing.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Lunch is on the way. We're at the Grill at the Harriman House in Reisterstown, Maryland. American Ramble is the book. Walk of Memory and Renewal. Neil King Jr. is the author. So, I mentioned in the open, Neil, that this place, the Grill, looms somewhat large in the early passages of this book. Tell my audience why.
You know, I'm trying to think. I think I was on day 4, so, I'd walked, we're probably 80 miles or thereabouts from D.C. I'd come up into this part of northern Maryland. We're on the kind of outer outskirts of Baltimore. I was heading up towards the Mason-Dixon line. There was a big storm kind of trailing me and coming in. I needed to find a refuge and a place to eat. So I came into John Reisterstown. I kind of tell the story about how this fellow, John Reister, came here and set up his shop, and soon his town was this place was named for him as it built out. I came into this place, the Harriman House, and sat at the bar, ordered some fish tacos and a beer, and it just opened rain outside, just pouring rain. And
Sheets of rain
sheets
falling
of rain.
outside.
I'm looking out the window, and in the most bizarre way, I just had this wave of just absolute joy. It was almost a kind of like sobbing, kind of like laughing, sobbing kind of joy, like, oh my God. And, people are sitting around, and I'm like, I hope somebody's not noticing this freak over here. It was like, they probably thought I just...
Is he having a seizure? What's going on over there?
Just received some horrible news. It was quite the contrary. And in the book, I try to describe, like, why do these things happen, and how can you have just this intense wave of joy? And I think the best I can explain it is it was my life had been stripped down to this utter simplicity of this backpack. Every day I was on this walk with this simple destination of the place I was going to end up that evening.
As promised, lunch has arrived.
Oh, right. And, it was just that everything for that period was basic and simple and pleasing. And there I was with my beer and fish tacos, and I couldn't have been happier. So I devote a fair chunk of that one chapter to that experience.
And as I read that chapter, I was reminded about something that you can find and you often refer to religious texts, not just of the Christian variety, but all religions. There is, or can be, an ineffable joy in simplicity.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I didn't anticipate that the walk was going to be some kind of spiritual walk, and certainly didn't design it that way. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of surprised how it became increasingly that way as I went. And I think some of it is when you're walking like this on a kind of pilgrimage, right? I was on my way to the Ramble in Central Park, and you get a certain mindset where you become almost a little bit biblical in that way. And you realize, as I did even on the second day, that all of us, from whatever readings or teachings we had as kids or later, we're familiar with the parables of the Good Samaritan and this kind of stuff. And these are mainly stories that take place as somebody was walking down a road and they had an encounter with one or two other people, and something meaningful happened. That's meaningful even now. Right. It resonates with us. Right. So I had a lot of those experiences, and I was like, whoa, these are like parable quality experiences. And so that kind of started to engender this kind of like spiritual thing. And then I, ran into people that dropped lines on me that came out of nowhere and that kind of thing.
Ted is one of them.
Oh, yeah.
He gave you a kind of framing for what he thought your journey was about, and this was very early on.
Yeah. That was actually the day before I was here in Reisterstown, and I was, I'd had this kind of distressing experience the day before where I had run into a guy outside of his house, and I had no water, and I had asked him if he knew where I could fill my water bottle, which was kind of a loaded question because, of course, his house was teeming with water. But he directed me to a convenience store, a couple of miles away, and we had a very odd conversation. He never got around to offering me any water, and so the next day I'm walking along kind of thinking, God, I wonder if I'm going to feel better about the country when I get to New York. And,
that was definitely a downer. That was an open opportunity for kindness a small gesture, and it never even surfaced.
Yeah, and I'd had a couple of experiences that day that were sort of along those lines, which I relate. And then the next day, I'm walking along, and I'm in this subdivision of sorts. It was mainly made up of African-American residents for whatever reason. And this guy, Ted, was at the end of his driveway getting his big trash can, about to bring it in. And he saw me, and I said hi. And he was like, what are you up to? And I said, I'm on my way. I'm taking this walk to New York, and I'm coming from Washington. I live right near the U.S. Capitol. I told him a few facts, and he just looked at me, and he was like, all right, let me tell you what you're doing. And he gave me this amazing sermon that I called this sermon of the tuning fork, because he was like, look, you are out. The country's been through all these horrors, George Floyd's death, the protests, the riots, even the tearing down of statues, all the horrors of the year of COVID. The country's out of joint. You're out to retune yourself, to get yourself in sync. And in doing that, you're going to do that for the whole country. And I was like, well, wait a minute, Ted. That's a lot of weight.
That's a bit much.
Yeah. He's like, I think you can do it. And I was like, okay. But he was great.
But this idea of getting in tune, and one of the other things that struck me about Ted's mini sermon was he said, you're screaming, we're all screaming.
Yeah. And he had been through some stuff himself. He was saying that he had gone through some drug addiction and had his big down moments, and that he was getting his act together, and he wanted to write a book called From the Pit to the Palace, A State of Mind. And I was thinking about it today when I was coming up here, that whole concept of a state of mind. I mean, so much of everything is what the state of mind is, right? Like, our life is determined by our own personal state of mind, and it's up to each of us to look after that state of mind. And I think the walk was a good state of mind adjuster. And I think that's what he was sort of talking about.
There's another theme that runs through the book. It starts at the beginning, and there's a reference to it at the very end. Seams.
Yeah. Wow.
What are the seams?
You're a perceptive reader.
When I say I love the book, I mean it. I really did.
Wow. So, even before I set off, a lot of people were kind of, and I met people of all ages who would be like, wow, how do you have the freedom, the ability to do this? And I would kind of make the argument that we all have the freedom or ability to do something like this. It's a matter of just seizing the moments and the opportunities and kind of wedging open seams. And as I described at one point, there are these seams in our lives where you've just lost your job, or you've just graduated from college, or you've just come out of the army, or maybe even you've just gotten divorced, or you've just recovered from an illness, or those kind of fissure moments. And you can kind of break away and say, okay, I'm not going to go to my next job immediately. I'm going to take 2 weeks and drive across the country, or do something else that kind of opens up a space. And for me, I'd come out of this illness. I had time being granted to me that I was fearful for a while I wouldn't have it all. And, COVID seemed to be lifting, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do this now. And it's about, I think, taking advantage of these freedoms that we actually do have that we deny ourselves too easily.
When you were in those seams, did you see your family better? Did you see yourself better?
Yeah, I mean, if you mean by this particular scene when I was out off on this walk, I mean, I got,
you're by yourself. You're by yourself.
I was by myself.
You were asked by one person, at least one person, isn't your wife with you, or is your wife going to be with you? And you're like, no, if somebody was with me, they would just be in the way.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, there were a couple, as you know, a couple of friends who came and met me in certain places, and we'd walk for a morning or something like that. But so much of the serendipitous, magical things that happened along the way would not have happened if I had been with someone else. You have to kind of just follow your own instincts. But on the other hand, giving yourself 26 days to walk, no, extraneous material going in my ears. I was just there to walk and think about my own life, my family, our collective past, our history, the stories that the land told, the canals, the railway beds, all that stuff. And that was a truly magical thing. And I really urge anybody, if you can wedge open the time to do it, to take a kind of prolonged, meditative look at some stretch of the country like that. It just repays the time immeasurably.
Or, in a more miniature way, take a walk on a regular basis
Yeah.
around where you live, because one of the ways the book ends is you came back to discover you barely knew your own block.
Yeah.
A block you'd lived on for 25 years.
Yeah.
We'll pick up on that on the other side of the break. I'm Major Garrett. We're in Reisterstown, Maryland. Neil King is our special guest. The book, American Ramble, A Walk of Memory and Renewal.
I never had anything in my ears. I was all birdsong, keeping aware of cars because I didn't want to get squashed.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Neil King is our special guest. The book, American Ramble. So let's just ask some practical questions.
Right.
On your walk, did you ever use any kind of listening device? Did you have earbuds? Did you do anything to distract yourself, or did you just listen to what was around you?
The latter. I never had anything in my ears. I was all birdsong, keeping aware of cars because I didn't want to get squashed. Conversations. One of the more magical moments in the book was when I encountered these Mennonite school kids playing softball, and it was something that I wouldn't have encountered if I hadn't glanced over, if I hadn't heard the whack of the baseball bat, if I hadn't seen this girl backing up and fielding this fly ball. And then, boom, a whole, door opens and I wander into it. You had to keep your awareness. I just wanted to have my thoughts as this kind of ongoing inner monologue, commentary, meditation on the stuff I was seeing and thinking about.
Did you wear a big floppy hat?
No, I just wore a cap.
Okay.
No big floppy hat, no.
Sunscreen?
No, I should have.
Probably.
Yeah, right.
And
Yeah.
the time of a year was late March, April.
It was very early spring.
Why did you choose that period of time?
I've been on Earth at that point. That was my 61st spring. And I realized within 5 or 6 days, I had never really, really watched a spring unfold, and it was great because I walked out at the very beginning. It was a slightly delayed spring that year. And I walked all along the whole time for weeks, the kind of leafing line. I was just like slightly ahead of it or behind it. So I got to study the unfolding and when do the maples come out and when do the sycamores come out and the whole thing. And that was just, and I talk a bit about that in the book. And it was a fantastic, it's the season of becoming. It's we have two big transition seasons, spring and fall, and spring is the becoming one. And it had to be a spring walk.
What were your encounters with vehicles like?
It's quite funny, and it was mainly after leaving Reisterstown that I had this walk up to where I was spending the night north of here, and it was that same rainstorm that pushed me into here for lunch was still happening, and I walked up the highway, and the cars were going by, and they were splashing water on me, and it was not exactly pleasant, but I was just walking along pondering a bunch of things, and soon the cars just became these kind of figments. They were things that I paid attention to because I didn't want to get hit by them, and yes, I knew they carried other human beings, but I kind of took on, I think, what must be the perspective of a deer or a rabbit or whatever. Like, okay, whatever. Like, they're there, they exist, but shame on them. They're not literally in the same place that I am. The experience I'm having, the richness of it, the continuous, ongoing kind of narrative quality of it is just not what they're experiencing. And I felt a certain kind of sympathy mixed with some kind of condescension towards the car people,
Of which you've now returned to.
Yes, I have. I will confess. Yeah.
We talked a moment ago about the broad intentions that you brought to this walk, but you also had some specific repertorial intentions. Yeah. And it's clear from the book that you had places that you wanted to go. You had set up encounters or interviews, access to documents. Did that go as you thought it would? Did you realize the things that you were hoping journalistically to realize? Yeah. How much intention went into that?
A lot. And, the book and the walk were very much a mix of kind of trying to build the day around one thing that I had prearranged or thought out in advance, a big theme of some kind, a person, historian, a mayor, something that was kind of a tentpole, and then everything else that would just happen along the way. And miraculously, the stuff that I had planned just fell into place. Like, you've been a reporter for a long time. Sometimes things don't fall into place. And they paid off to me in just huge ways. And, a lot of there's many things that I wanted to poke at, but a lot of it was kind of the big debate that we're a part of now of who do we honor, who deserves to be on a pedestal, who deserves a statue, you know.
So let's jump into that.
Okay.
2 names, James Buchanan, Thaddeus Stevens.
Yeah, I know. That's great stuff. I mean, I walk into Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In Lancaster, leading up to the Civil War, had 2 figures in it, people that had both made their careers there. James Buchanan, who was one of the most accomplished people to ever step into the White House, the first or the last president before Abraham Lincoln took over the unfolding disaster. He had, been Secretary of State and ambassador at all these places and so on, and yet he was what they called a doughface, which was a southern sympathizer, a coddler of slaveholders, very much of a very gradual, okay, well, let's get rid of slavery, but let's take our sweet time. Thaddeus Stevens, same town, also a lawyer, total firebrand.
Almost the same neighborhood. I mean,
Yeah.
They, as you write, they walked the same streets, went to the same barber.
Yeah.
Had almost all the same associations.
Yeah, their lives.
And radically different perspectives.
Yeah, and Thaddeus Stevens, he became basically Abraham Lincoln's conscience. I mean, he was one of the big forces to push for the Emancipation Proclamation. No, let's do it now. For letting blacks into the Union Army. Let's do it now. He was big on reparations right then, which is, of course, when it should have happened. And he was one of the founders of the Second Founding. Once the war ended, Lincoln had been shot. He was the one who helped push through a bunch of the big amendments that have become then the foundations of civil rights ever since then, and really some of the most important parts of the Constitution. And they were both there. And by the way, when I walked into the town, they were getting rid of James Buchanan Elementary as a name. They were seeking if someone else to rename the school for. They were just getting around to paying lavish attention to Thaddeus Stevens's house, which had been a drug den and a used car lot and all kinds of things that it had fallen into disuse, while James Buchanan's mansion on the edge of town had been sort of meticulously looked after by the Junior League and all this stuff. And my fascination with it was, okay, so Thaddeus Stevens' star is starting to rise. He will over time. By the way, in the Lincoln movie, he played a big role in that. Tommy Lee Jones played him. And, so I think we're entering a Thaddeus Stevens moment when the guy is going to start to get his due. And yes, James Buchanan is always near the bottom of worst presidents, so he's not been held up. But even in Lancaster, they're making this big shift. And I think that reevaluation, that's what history does. That's what we do all the time, and it's a valuable exercise.
You write also in the book about Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon.
Yeah. My that was, of course, was north of here, still to come, encountering the Mason-Dixon line. And, one of the things I tried to do in the book was give these as quick and pungent and potent as possible kind of, okay, here's the guys that surveyed the Mason-Dixon line. Here's a little bit of what you need to know about the curious things that brought them together and the kind of obscurity that they went off to soon after they drew that line that was named after them, the line between slavery and freedom, essentially, and a line that became hugely important after 1830 when Missouri was let into the country or into the Union, and the whole issue of where there would be slavery and where there wouldn't be slavery became such a huge malignant sore that led to the Civil War happening. And so I was fascinated by what it would be to encounter this theoretical thing that they had drawn, right? That was this big dividing line.
They drew not for the reasons that you just described,
right,
but to try to settle, as I read, a long simmering territorial dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania.
Exactly. How we have the borders that we have now between the states itself, I'm sure there are books written about it. It's such a bizarre and arcane thing because, various kings and others are saying, oh, you Calvert, or oh, you William Penn, you can have this territory with these lines. But it was all very notional. They didn't even know really what they were talking about. So, disputes arose, and this dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania went on for a really long time. So this was the English saying, okay, let's resolve this thing once and for all.
And some manner of science was used to try to resolve it. I mean, they were pretty good at this surveying process.
Yeah, they were, and of course they used a lot of celestial measurements and other things to determine exactly what I've forgotten what the parallel was, the 42nd or something like that. And so they had to draw, and then once they got further out west, where it was basically Indian territory, they just stopped basically at the top of the Appalachian crest, and they were like, okay, we're not going to draw. That's not even our land anymore at this point, which, of course, it then became so-called our land.
Exactly. Lines are drawn, lines end, and all sorts of things are decided on either side of those lines. One of the themes in American Ramble, Neil King Jr. is the author. I'm Major Garrett. Segment 4 of The Takeout in just 1 second.
The greatest privilege any of us can have, or any of us can extend to one another, is that sense of belonging.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to The Grill at Harriman House in Reisterstown, Maryland. The book is American Ramble, A Walk of Memory and Renewal. The author, Neil King Jr. Briefly, Neil, tell my audience what you did as a correspondent in your life before you became the author of this quite remarkable book.
So I was a newspaper reporter for a long time. I'd worked in the U.S. for smaller publications in Florida in particular. I bolted to Europe with my soon-to-be wife in the early 90s when everything was up for grabs there. We
lived in one of Europe's most beautiful cities. I regard it as the most beautiful city in Europe, even though I haven't been to Paris, so I'm probably a little bit blind, but Prague.
Yeah, Prague was amazing. We moved there right when everything was up for grabs and a fascinating time, and we hooked up with the Wall Street Journal. And so through the 90s, most of the Clinton administration, I was overseas. And I came back just for the tail end of that. Again with the Wall Street Journal in Washington. I was chief diplomatic correspondent. On 9/11, I was national security reporter. I was the person who wrote the first profile of Osama bin Laden 3 years before 9/11 in the Wall Street Journal. When, the planes hit the trade centers, it was me and another guy, David Cloud, that were the guys having to cover it. Our story was at the top of the paper that next day.
Won a Pulitzer Prize for that?
Yeah, exactly. And, then I went on to do a lot of stuff. I was a political reporter for a while. I covered a couple of presidential campaigns. I then became chief economic correspondent, global economics editor, I should say, and ran all of our economics coverage. And then I left at the end of 2016. That was my, just to go off kind of as, we were talking about before, and just seeking to do some other stuff.
Mm-hmm. What did that bank of knowledge do for you, if anything, on this walk?
In large part, I think because of both my economic reporting and my political reporting, I had a good feel for the granularity of the country and, the differences county by county, and a sensitivity for all of those kind of nuances along the way. And I think that made a difference. Of course, there's also just the organizational ability. If you're a reporter, kind of how to fill out a day of reporting and what's going to hold up a story and what kind of people you would best look up. And
did economics look different to you up close?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, the one thing that really came through in the walk is that each of these various quadrants, pick your definition of a quadrant, but mainly counties, can be just strikingly different. And the variations of the places you go through when you're seeing them at 3 miles an hour are really a lot more clear. And obviously when you're coming into South Philly and seeing that was my first real encounter with kind of deliberate decay and just neighborhoods left to fester. And it was a fascinating thing because the day before I'd spent at Valley Forge, where we've lavished all this attention to preserving and recreating this one winter.
Buffing it all up. Yeah.
Of 1778, 79, and then you walk into South Philly and it's like, oh, okay, here's a place that we're not buffing up at all. And so there were a lot of those contrasts. You see those obviously everywhere in America.
Mm-hmm. You write in the book that trying to figure out America, young America, was kind of a European obsession in the 1820s to 1850s. lots of Europeans came, lots of journals and treks across this young, bustling country were written about. And then you also write, in our history, the idea of the wanderer, the person walking and taking stock of things, is not really that much in contrast with our own mythology and culture.
No.
You joined those ranks. Did you feel intimidated by doing that?
No, I felt really a kind of a kinship. Really, I had originally planned to walk out the door at the end of March of 2020. Of course, none of us could walk out our doors at that point, so I had this delay, which was kind of welcomed, and it gave me even more time to read so many of these books. They're all collected online at the Library of Congress. There are hundreds of them. I downloaded most of them to my laptop. I looked through a lot of them. I read more thoroughly others of them, and they kind of set the stage for my walk. And there's Alexis de Tocqueville, who many listeners would be familiar with, Democracy in America. Charles Dickens, about 10 years later, 1840 or so, came to the United States, made his trek from New York down to Washington and elsewhere, and had his shocking encounter with slavery and all of those kinds of experiences. And it was all really useful to me because it gave me the license and kind of built a model for every encounter that I was going to have was going to be significant to me, relevant to my reporting, and worth passing on. And because that was very much the way that they looked at America at that time. And in a way, I kind of hope this book sort of revives that genre, that kind of type of inquiry.
You also write in the book about this word, privilege.
Yeah.
That being a white man of means makes this journey easier.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no denying that at all. And that is a question that I probed a lot while I took the walk. I talk a lot about belonging. Very much my belief that the greatest privilege any of us can have or any of us can extend to one another is that sense of belonging. You come into this bar, you belong here, welcome, And I received a lot of welcome along the way from all kinds of people. And I think it's quite likely that was more readily granted because of the way I appear. On the other hand, and a lot of people have asked me this on book tour and stuff, could this or that type of person, a black man, a white woman, whomever, take this walk? And I argue very much that they could. And I've had this discussion with women, with black men. I've come to know a guy named Ken Johnston, who last year did a walk, a black man, from Harriet Tubman's birthplace to the Canadian border. And he's done a lot more of this kind of walking than I have, including in the South. And he's a firm believer, as I am, that if you're inclined to it, if you consider yourself good at mingling with people, if you have your own sort of sense of belonging, then do it, and I do believe that that's true.
Describe that instant when you are encountered by a stranger, they regard you as a stranger, and there's that pregnant moment where they're coming to a decision about whether to welcome you or whether to not be so welcoming.
Yeah, I had so many of those moments, and I try to describe them for what they're worth. And I get into a fair bit of the idea, which I do believe in, that when you walk into a room, into a barn, I barged into the barn of a Mennonite farrier, who was shoeing a horse. You kind of create that space, or certainly alter it by going into it. And I was at a moment and during a stretch of a high degree of receptivity and openness. I was out enthusiastically to see what was going on, see what people were doing. And I think that kind of, maybe, I don't know, the look on my face, just people would turn, they would size you up, and they would respond positively for the most part, I think, because of that look on my face.
That goes to a larger point. There are many in American Ramble. One of them is how you arrive makes a difference. Stay tuned for the Takeout Outtake Especial. American Ramble's the book. Neil King's been our special guest. Neil, thanks so much.
Thank you. A lot of people who live in or know New York well laugh, but I had this rapturous moment while walking up the incline of the Bayonne Bridge.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. American Ramble is the book, a walk of memory and renewal. Neil King Jr. is the author. We are at the Grill at the Harriman House in Reisterstown, Maryland. I don't want to steal this from the audience because it's a really beautiful moment in the book, but I want you to talk about it.
Okay.
You've been on the road a great number of days. You've walked. Your back has been aching. Your legs have been aching periodically, not persistently. But you come to this place where you see in the skyline your destination.
No.
Carry on.
Yeah. I talk about that at various book events, and I was out in Park City, Utah, a fairly large group of people, and I said, when I mention this, a lot of people who live in or know New York well laugh, but I had this rapturous moment while walking up the incline of the Bayonne Bridge, and half the people in Park City, Utah burst out laughing, which I guess shows that many of them were from New York.
Precisely.
Bayonne Bridge connects Staten Island with Bayonne, New Jersey. It goes over the Kilvan Kull, which is that body of water. It's a huge bridge built in the 30s. And I was walking along. It was the next to last day before I got to Manhattan. And I was looking down, thinking about some stuff, and I just lifted my eyes, and boom, there was the island of Manhattan. And, I argue we humans have built a lot of things in America. We think of the Golden Gate Bridge, and you could have your list. The island of Manhattan is one of the most gorgeous things that human hands have built in this country. And that morning, there it was. It was early in the morning. It was a sparkling sight, and it just blew me away. I was overcome. I mean, to call it rapture on the Bayonne Bridge is not an overstatement. I kind of crumbled almost to the ground. I was just like, wow. And, there's a great line, which I have in the book about from The Great Gatsby that Fitzgerald had about how the Williamsburg Bridge had this power to recreate the island of Manhattan for anyone going across it. And, I think that power of renewal, the subtitle of the word renewal, is a power that we kind of grant ourselves by taking these moments away. And I wouldn't have had that if I'd been driving along in a car, and I've been over that bridge before. I drove a cab in New York. I've seen Manhattan a zillion times. It was as though I was seeing it for the first time. Yeah.
One last concept. Yes, you can be a wanderer, but you talk about the importance of a destination.
Yeah.
That pull that the destination gives you a kind of order and a kind of psychic balance while you're wandering and encountering all the serendipitous things along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the origins, there's the word destination, there's the word destiny. They're obviously very closely related, and one of the beauties of the walk was that every day I woke up and I had a destination, which was for that day my destiny, and it gave a sense of purpose, and that everything else then that came along the way was added value. And there was something just about that kind of stripped down nature of it that gave the magic that the walk had. And when I finally then got to my ultimate destination, which was this magnificent creation Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux had built, right before the Civil War and even into the Civil War, just north of the lake in Central Park. They call the Ramble, and it's like this convoluted wilderness stuck in the middle of this urban setting, and it's just a beautiful place that many people that have visited New York or certainly live there know. And it was a great destination to have, and when I got to it, I had another kind of moment of rapture, and it was a nice thing to have had set out for and have be my beacon over all those weeks.
So everyone who appears on the show answers three of my questions, the same three questions. So take these in whichever order you prefer. Neil King Jr., most influential book in your life and why? Favorite movie? And if you're going to enjoy some music for a long walk or a long drive or a long flight, what kind of music, artist, or genre is that most likely to be?
So favorite book, I'm not a very good favorite person, but I would say in the context of this book itself, I would say my favorite book is In Patagonia, which is a book that Bruce Chatwin wrote about a bizarre and fascinating trip that he took through Patagonia in the 70s. I would say favorite movie, again, I'm not the greatest on movie. I've always been a lover of Chinatown. It's a movie I could
Robert
watch
Town.
I could watch multiple times. Has so many layers to it.
And I have. It's a phenomenal movie. One of the all-time best.
You know, I think just genres of music, I'd have to say kind of Americana folk music. And I mean, this is not at all my favorite artist, but I've been really impressed of late by Zach Bryan, who came onto the scene out of nowhere last year, basically. Well, not for everybody out of nowhere last year, but for me. And he's phenomenal and a great kind of interpreter of a certain swath of American life now, and somebody very much worth listening to.
Neil King, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
It's been fantastic. I really appreciate it, Major.
We'll see you next week, folks.